Hello. My name is Tonono. I am a reader and a lover of all things history and historical. Over the past couple of months, I've discovered that there's really not much YouTube content, or at least not many South African YouTubers who are focused on or focus on South African history. So I decided to plug that gap and start my own, just sharing some of the experiences I've come, or some of the things I've come across in my engagement with historical literature. So this being the first episode, I thought I'd start where it all started, 1652, with the arrival of the Dutch East India Company at the Cape. And yes, I understand that some may say that this is not where South African history begins, and there's a very clear argument to be made. Actually, not like I understand that there have been people in South Africa beyond or before 1652 and have lived here for centuries, and so South African history does not begin in 1652. That's the point I'm trying to make. A typical example is in the Gauteng region, as far back as the 6th century. There were Sotho-Tswana communities, according to Legassick, who were mining metal. And again, if you listen to the historical narratives of Barolong, they've always been associated with metal. Insimbi is their totem. So there's a lot of evidence for the existence of people in South Africa way before 1652. If you look at Mohamed Adhikari's work, much of it looks at the San, the Ku, whatever you want to call them, and they've been mining. These people have been mining in the Southern Cape for eons and eons before 1652. Even around the 15th and the 16th century, the people who lived along the coasts of South Africa were used to trading with ships passing on their way to India and the East. So there's a great argument to be made that, listen, South African history does not begin in 1652. And a very little known fact is that the Portuguese were once defeated massively by a group of about 100 Khoi, if I'm not mistaken. They're beaten by a small group of people in and around Mossel Bay. This was around the 15th century. And perhaps that's the reason why the Portuguese were beaten. Perhaps that's why we're not Portuguese colony. So these guys were beaten, and then the Portuguese ran away and decided, perhaps we'll go next door to Mozambique and try our luck there. The point is, the people who had lived along the coasts of Southern Africa had always for years traded with passing ships. They were aware that ships on their way to India and China and all those places would come look for refreshments, look for water, and that thing. So point is, 1652 does not mark the beginning of the South African state. What it does, it doesn't mark the beginning of South Africa, and doesn't mark the story of the people who lived in South Africa. That story is way old. However, what it does mark is the birth of the South African state as we currently have it today. It is for the first time that, or at least it is the first time that a settlement is then established in South Africa. Previous to that, passing ships just would get water, trade, go on their merry way. But now, and the story of how the Cape was born is actually a very fortuitous one, which starts in about 1849, in 1649. Sorry, I'm a lover of 19th century missionary history, so I think in 1800s. So about 1648, the Dutch East India Company ship known as the Haarlem crashes somewhere around Cape Town. A man called Jans or Lerend Jans, and another one called Jan van Riebeck, part of that shipwreck / rescue mission of those shipwrecked sailors who lived at the Cape. What had happened with them, with their shipwreck, they then spent about 3 months or so waiting for passing ships that on their way back to Europe so that they could, which would rescue them, that kind of thing. And in that meantime, they started getting a new idea of what actually the Cape was like. Previous to that, the sort of the general maritime view was that you don't want to live in that place. There's nothing of value there. The weather's horrible. There's not much to trade with. So the shipwreck of the Haarlem does something very interesting for the course of South African history and the Dutch East India Company, is that Van Riebeck and Jans then start making a plea to their bosses at the Dutch East India Company that, listen, there's business to be had here. The Cape is not actually as bad as we actually thought it is. We've lived there during that short period of time, we saw a lot of opportunities that we could actually hone in on. And they make a compelling argument about the starting of a halfway house that would then grow vegetables, which would then supply Dutch East India Company ships, as well as other passing ships for a bit of an extra buck. And then also they start making the idea that, perhaps we could start trading with the locals, trading other skins and valuables, other items and ivory skins, and look for gold and see if there's any profit to be made for the company. And the company and the Dutch East India Company kind of agrees to this, and it makes sense. It seems like a solid business proposal. And one of the arguments that Jans and Van Riebeck make is that St. Helena which was the kind of the hub within maritime routes, where everyone going to India would kind of stop, look for food, refreshments, and that stuff. St. Helena at the time was becoming crowded and was being destroyed. Sailors were just pretty much destroying water holes, sort of killing as much as they could, killing too much. And basically it's the kind of destruction that always follows European civilization, because everywhere you get like Europeans coming, there's always a trail of destruction that follows. So in light of that, these guys are saying perhaps the Cape it'll be a nice way where we as the Dutch can establish a port that we control, and we'll supply our ships, and it'll lower the cost of doing business. It'll expedite all of these things, and the Dutch East India Company agrees. And they say, you know what? Let's actually do this. And then they give them so the plan was that they would go along and establish this halfway house. It was not to have more than 60 people max when the project was fully run, so it was fully functional. So it was just supposed to be a very tiny spot, and those 60 people who would be left would really mainly be soldiers who would stand to protect this place. And the reason they would stand to protect this place was not really from a fear of the inhabitants. Jans actually makes a very interesting account that every time the people of the Cape were very civil, and that every time any Dutch sailor was killed, it was because they had started something. So the protection was really not about protecting the interests of the Dutch East India Company from the locals, but rather from protecting it from the other maritime powers and the other sort of enemies. At the time, the Dutch were at war with a number of people, and Europeans are generally at war with each other. So the Dutch were fighting with the French, if I'm not mistaken, and also the Portuguese, and all these contesting sort of geopolitics of the time, and the English were also caught up in that mess. So really the idea was to start the settlement, this halfway house, and just protect it with about 60, 70 soldiers, so that our enemies don't try and counter this. We'll source, what's this? We'll start a bit of gardens here and there for the sake of producing vegetables, and we'll source meats and other tradables with the locals. And yeah, it seemed like it'll cut the cost of doing business. Seemed like a workable plan until they actually got to the Cape. They arrived in about April 1652, and then started planting. Started preparing to plant their vegetables and also look to trade started looking for people to trade with for cattle. Now, a very interesting, a very significant part of that operation was Van Riebeeck and his council, because they pretty much were the first form of government at the Cape, in the sense that they determined what the rules for the Dutch East India Company employees were. They determined what were the do's and the don'ts, where they could and could not go, and what the daily operations would be. So the council became effectively the first kind of legislative body at the Cape, and because part of the people who were brought here were soldiers who were meant to protect this settlement as it established itself. So that is, at that point, we see now the beginnings of the sort of legislature, and the council was always interested in one thing, really: the protection of a monopoly of the Dutch East India Company on trade. So ensuring that the Dutch East India Company has a monopoly on the cattle that get to the Cape, and that is being traded with other ships, and also the ships that are the Dutch East India Company's fleet. So with that, they get to the Cape in about April 1652. They start preparing the works, start planting, and okay, there's a bit of number of people who are coming to trade, but they're not at the moment. They didn't start out trading the cattle that the VOC needed, but rather things like ostrich eggshells and other little trinkets like feathers. So when they get to the Cape, the first thing that happens, they get there, and then within a few weeks, the weather is horrible, as anyone knows in Cape Town. Winter is a time for rains. Even till this day, winter is a time for rains. Van Riebeeck gets to Cape Town, and all his lands and all his gardens that he had planted, these crops where he would then get food supply to supply, all of it is destroyed. And the first crop is destroyed. Within the first 6 months, there's really no one trading cattle, coming to the fort to trade cattle with them, and for 6 months, and it's like, okay, things are not going according to plan. By the end of the first year, Van Riebeeck was already asking that, hey guys, can I please be posted elsewhere? This Cape business is not going to work for me. But the bosses didn't agree, and of course he stayed at the Cape for a lot longer. But things started to change in and around November. Out of nowhere started then coming an influx of people, of Cape inhabitants, and these people Van Riebeeck calls the Saldaners in his journals. Now these guys, the Saldaners, are rich in cattle, and they start trading with Van Riebeeck. And Van Riebeeck is now, things are looking bright. It's like, okay, perhaps if we could trade a lot more with these guys, this thing is actually workable. Until two things happen. The Saldanhas leave again with their thousands and thousands and hundreds and thousands of cattle. Number one, they leave. Another thing that happens. One of the key facilitators of this trade between the Dutch and the Saldanhas is a man in historical literature known as Hottentot Harry. What made Harry this sort of brokering figure was his ability to speak a bit of broken English. Like I said, the people along the Cape had always interacted with passing ships, and so in that process had long picked up ways of trading and language and all those kinds of things. So Harry has this niche advantage that he can actually communicate and broker deals between the Dutch, who are desperately looking for cattle, and the Khoi. I'll call them the Khoi, but there's a question to be had there, which we will answer in our second episode. Let's call them the Khoi for now, or the Kun, or the Ku, or Kukun, whatever you want to call them. Sure, he gets there. Now, and then shortly after the Saldanhas leave, one other thing happens. 40 of the Dutch East India Company's cattle stolen, and Harry becomes this prime suspect. Sure as the case may be, Harry disappears for 2 years. He disappears for 2 years. No one knows where he is. But in comes another group of cattle-rich guys, and he called, and Van Riebeck in his journals and other records call them the Cape Men. Of course, again, these terms are very useless. But there's another group of people called the Cape Men. They come in here, they're rich in cattle. But the only difference between them and the Saldanhas is that they really trade like minimally with the Dutch. So they are hovering, they are settled, they're grazing in and around Cape Town in very close proximity. And Van Riebeck is looking at all the these thousands and thousands of herds of cattle. And these guys are just trading like one a day. And it's not at the pace that Van Riebeck needs to firstly sustain his group of about 100 soldiers and employees of the Dutch East India Company. So the rations that those guys are getting are a bit taxing on Van Riebeck, on the food supply, and also they're not getting as much vegetables, such that at some stage they were relying on rations from passing ships, but that's a story for another day. So the Cape Men, and this really frustrates Van Riebeck. It frustrates Van Riebeck, and the fact that these guys have got so much cattle, but are really trading very minimalistically, and it starts creating a bit of friction with them. And Van Riebeck at some stage is now touting the idea that, you know what, perhaps these guys, in any case, are Harry's allies, and Harry stole our cattle, and now, and these guys have really, there've been a number of skirmishes with them, and these guys, and this is what then Van Riebeck says: their ill behavior is consequently scarcely to be put up with any longer, and these guilty hordes, once paid, it would perhaps be somewhat cheaper taking, as aforesaid, their cattle for ourselves, and food and refreshment, and for their persons using them as slaves in chains for fetching firewood and other necessary work, for the relief of our Netherlanders, who have consequently had to endure the most insufferable annoyance from these rogues, to which we are daily urged by our people. So what is effectively happening is that Van Riebeck is irritated, and then miraculously comes back Harry. And Harry, after a 2-year disappearance, this is now, he comes back in about 1855, and he says, guys, the reason I left, there are a number of reasons why I left. One of them is that the guys that are now surrounding you, that are not trading with you, are not the Saldanas that we started trading off with. And these guys are actually enemies of the Saldanas, and as long as these guys are here, the Saldanas are not going to come here and trade with you. So I can broker a deal where you guys help us remove these guys here, and we take their cattle, and we'll trade. The moment these guys are out of your area, or out of this area, then you will see growth in trade. And like any other business, the Dutch East India Company are like, hey, listen, don't get us involved in your politics. We just want to trade with anyone who wants to trade. So be it your enemies or us. So we're not there. Like Assisi, don't get us involved in your politics. But the problem that Van Riebeeck has now is the fact that as long as these guys are here, he's not getting enough cattle. And Harry here is the only person who's been able to broker cattle deals that are somewhat sufficient. And so Harry is then plays this middleman kind of situation where he's a consultant. He goes into interior parts to find people who are willing to trade. He goes with copper and tobacco given and other gifts like booze and pipes to trade with people living in the interiors, because the Cape men, the Saldanas, don't want to come to the fort anymore because of the presence of the Cape man. And so in the midst of that, like any middleman deals, Harry starts accruing a lot of cattle, and the Dutch East India Company is like, hey, but guy, why are you accruing so much cattle but we're not seeing much of that cattle? So they're accusing each other of Harry's taking VOC copper to trade cattle so that he can get it, and he's enriching himself, and it's complicated stuff. But the point is, the Dutch East India Company doesn't want to get involved in the politics, so they say. But all they want to trade with anyone who's willing to trade. But Harry is in this position where he is the broker, basically, and they need his services. And he does give them a number of trinkets, but after a while, the relationship becomes bad between the VOC and Harry, such that he's then banished to Robben Island, which at the time was used as a place to fatten up the sheep that the Dutch East India Company had been trading with. So off is Harry, and is shipped to effectively become the first prisoner at the Dutch East India Company. And in about 1857, so this is like 5 years into this thing now, a plan is then agreed to by the Dutch East India Company to get about 9 colonists who would then settle and build a settlement in the Cape. And they would be the sort of the first free burghers. I want to read a clip, an extract from the letter, giving instruction to Van Riebeeck about this. And it says, "The reasons which have induced our honorable employers to take the possession of this place are fully detailed in their instructions and successive dispatches. You are well aware that the chief objective was to raise for the crews of the company's ships the needful supplies, whether fruits and vegetables or fresh meat from every sort of suitable livestock, with a view not only to the health of the servants of the company, but to such subsequent extension would tend in time to diminish the great expense which has been incurred by reaping profits from every honorable source of agriculture, internal trade, and foreign commerce. Towards these objectives, you already, under the orders have received, advanced so far that we are now in a condition not only to defend ourselves against any violence from inhabitants, but with slight difficulty to drive them away and banish them, or even kill them, should any attempt to do us any wrong deserving of such treatment. And then the directors continue to say that you endeavor to encouraging the employment of as many burghers as possible so as to relieve the company from the payment of wages, always trying to diminish the number of salaried servants in proportion to the increase of the number of burghers, until that the servants is reduced to about 70, of whom 50 must be soldiers, to defend the fort and protect them, and protect the cultivation of lands and burghers against any violence offered against them. So in about 1857, he gets this directive that, listen, they're going to be colonists coming in here, they're going to settle there, they're going to establish themselves, make the necessary arrangements. And of course, because of the number of the kind of the deteriorating relations between the Dutch East India Company of Van Riebeeck and Co. and the people who had been living there for generations, because of the contestations and the politics around there. There are contestations about the resources. To such effect, I want to read another extract from Van Riebeeck's journals, and in where he says, let me just find it, where he says. They then intimated that we were living upon their lands, and that they perceived that we were building with activity in order never to go away, and therefore they would not be able to barter with us any more cattle, for we took the best pastures for our cattle, and so on. So that's just to give you a sense that it created contestation around resources. And those two resources mainly being, one, land, two, the economy or cattle. Now in South Africa, or in Southern Africa, cattle has always been a staple part of the economy. Historically, it's always been a very central part of the economy, and with that, the need for grazing pastures became a very critical strategic resource. So there's now this contestation over resources with the Cape inhabitants, or the owners of the Cape, but because of the stringent nature of Dutch East India Company regulations on its people, a number of them always try to run. They always try to run away and just to give you a sense of some of the regulations of the Dutch East India Company, this is one of them. All persons of whatever quality or are further expressly prohibited from carrying on any traffic or barter with the natives or savages, except with the knowledge of the consent of the commander and the council. Whether cattle or refreshments or any other article whatsoever may not, by their eagerness and thoughtfulness of a common purpose or others, become proud and dear with their cattle and other articles. And thus the company's wares be brought into disesteem. So basically, there was a lot of control on who trades, and a number of two things happened from that. Because of the tight fist of the Dutch East India Company, a number of people, there were always people looking to escape. Some people tried to go into the interiors on their own, others returned back, like after a few days of trying it out and realizing, we're starving, it's better to just stick with the Dutch East India Company. So, and it is those kinds of groups of people that now, as they were trying to run away from the control of the Dutch East India Company, what the Dutch East India Company would do is that the council would then extend its borders to say, if you're within these borders, you're still within us, you're still within our reach. And in that way, a cycle of the expansion of the South African frontier began, but also it created, in that, there was also the nucleus of what would later be the Trek Boere, or the Afrikaners, or whatever you want to call them. And again, even there, it's a very complex kind of situation. We'll delve into those complexities. So essentially, the whole setup at the Cape for about the first 100, 200 years was really about maximizing profit for the Dutch East India Company. And that is what had driven the sort of the setting up of these structures that ultimately morphed into the Cape Colony and the state, and the South African state. So from the guys who were disgruntled in the Cape, who then went to establish their own Afrikaner Boer republics, who then later would unite with South Africa, with the Cape Colony to form the Union of South Africa, and blah, blah, blah. From that, it all started with just people trying to get away from the menace and grip of the Dutch East India Company and look for trade opportunities in the interior parts. But it also created some illegal trade as per in articles like cattle, ivory, gold, and all those things. And yeah, but we'll get into all of these things. Ultimately, it was these business interests, these corporate interests of the Dutch East India Company that set up the South African state, firstly. And at every point, so in the 18th century, you've got the Van der Stel cabal, named after, who Stellenbosch is named after, kind of ironic given the Stellenbosch mafia. So they're the sort of what Van der Stels and them do as a cabal is that they annex a number of land and start projects as wine farms that they then sell to the Dutch East India Company at a handsome price. And then 19th century, you get guys like your Cecil John Rose with his British South Africa Company that's starting to venture into north of Africa, going to Zambia, Zimbabwe, and all sorts of business interests. And then gold is discovered somewhere in Gauteng, and then are born the Rand Lords, the Oppenheimers, and all those kinds of guys. So from inception, the South African state was never created with the interests of citizens or a society. The South African state at inception has always been driven by private corporations and commercial ventures. And that, for the past 400 years, has always been the case, right up until the state capture that we are now seeing is a state capture. So these are some of the historical legacies that are part of the South African historical narrative. And as we go along, hopefully we will touch on a number of issues. And this brings to an end my first episode. I will share some of the links to the reading materials, but much of this stuff that I was reading from is from extracts of a book written by Donald Moodie called The Record, or a series of official papers relative to the condition and treatment of the native tribes of South Africa. It was published in about 1832. You can find it on www.archive.org. But I'll share the links to these places, and I'll share other reading material that kind of makes the argument that South Africans have been here for donkeys of years, or people have been living in South Africa for donkeys of years, way before 1652, like the works of Martin Legassick, Mohamed Adhikari, and the likes. So, with that being said, that brings an end to our first episode, and our next episode will look at who were the people that Van Riebeck met at the Cape? It's a very controversial and very interesting thing. It's not as simple as we may think at face value, because there are a number of complexities that need to be ironed out. So, but until then, please do share this, like, subscribe, get the word out there. I'd really like to get, at the very least, to 100 subscribers by the end of this week. So if I can get to, the quicker I can get to the first 100 subscribers, hopefully I can then give you a second episode. And thank you very much for your time. Much love.